Fact-checking Mark Golding and Fayval Williams. How much would the PNP's plans really cost the country? I'm Kalila Reynolds, founder and CEO of Money Media, Money Made Simple. Jamaica's Budget Debates 2025 just wrapped up, and there's a lot of controversy around the cost of the opposition PNP's plans. Finance Minister Fayval Williams said,
they would run a huge budget deficit of some $204 billion.
But opposition leader Mark Golding said,
we're talking about 23 billion plus the NHT 34 billion.
So who's right? Would the PNP run a $204 billion deficit leading to FinSAC 2.0 like Fayval claims? Or would the PNP's plans only cost around $34 billion like Mark says? Those two numbers are miles apart, but lucky for you, you have me to run the numbers. All right. So first of all, how does Fayval get all the way to a $204 billion deficit? This is the table she presented to Parliament comparing the JLP government's budget to a potential PNP budget. And you can see the $204 billion deficit right there versus a surplus of $780 million for the government. Here's the PNP's costing according to Fayval. First of all, she's assuming that the PNP would give up $139 billion in non-tax revenue. This includes $11.4 billion taken from NHT, which the PNP said they would put back, and $128 billion from securitization. Mark had strongly criticized the government for this securitization program. In his budget speech on March 18, he said it was essentially the government selling off the country's future revenues.
This will be another run-with-it transaction, selling off future revenues to fund expenditures for this year's budget.
However, in a point of order during Fayval's speech on March 25, he clarified.
I never said that securitization is in itself wrong. I said the use of the proceeds to fund the recurrent budget, using future revenue to meet today's expenses is what is wrong.
Well, that's the same thing that he said before, and that does imply that the PNP would not be using securitization to fund their budget. So, point for Fayval. Deduct the full $139.8 billion from the PNP's column. Before I move on, though, let me clarify something, because this is the major reason the PNP's budget would go over so far. The line item for $139.8 billion in the budget is simply described as non-tax revenue. There's no breakdown of what comprises that non-tax revenue. We know $11.4 billion comes from the NHT, and Mark did seek clarity as to what comprises the rest. He shared a response to his query from the Ministry of Finance with us here at Money Media via WhatsApp. The response said, the major sources are the National Housing Trust and the monetization of contractual cash flows. However, there's no additional breakdown. Money Media also sent a request for this information to the Ministry of Finance, but we haven't received a response yet as I'm recording this. In Fayval's rebuttal, she credited the entire balance to securitization, and without further information, I have to assume that she is accurately representing this. The next point was on the tax givebacks. Based on Fayval's calculations, the PNP would be giving up $25.5 billion in taxes. This includes $8 billion in asset taxes, $11 billion by giving MSMEs a 3-year tax break on corporate income tax, $2.5 billion from the food import tax, and over $3 billion from the employer tax credit. However, Mark's numbers here are vastly different. He pointed out that they would phase in the asset tax rollback over 5 years, so that would only cost $2 billion in year 1. Point for Mark. He claims that the MSME corporate tax break would only cost $1 billion, not $11 billion. I assume Fayval's number is if this tax break applied to all MSMEs, but the PNP has clarified that it's only for new MSMEs, so point for Mark. Mark agreed with Fayval that they would be giving up $2.5 billion from the food import tax, so point for Fayval. Finally, on taxes, he didn't specify an impact from the employer tax credit, which Fayval listed at $3 billion. He also didn't contest the cost of removing taxes from laptops and tablets for education at $350 million, so I'll give those points to Fayval. That brings us to a total of $8.85 billion in tax givebacks by the PNP. The last section is on the cost of the PNP's promises. Fayval claims it will cost $48.8 billion. Mark puts it at half that, $23 billion. Here's the list of promises. Mark didn't contest the cost of raising school standards, funding special needs, matching companies' investment in their workers, or providing student meals, so I'll give those points to Fayval. The major contention, however, is in the cost of the PNP's 1 degree per household policy. Fayval put it at a whopping $31.5 billion. But opposition spokesman on education Damian Crawford later clarified at a press conference that this program would only be for families that don't already have a university degree. He said about 6,000 students would benefit in the first year, bringing the cost to $3.9 billion. The electricity regularization program would also only be $1 billion instead of $2 billion because the government has already allocated $1 billion. This brings the cost of the PNP's promises to about $22 billion. Let's add that all up. Giving up non-tax revenue would cost $140 billion. Giving up certain taxes would cost $8.8 billion, and increasing social spending would cost $22 billion, for a total of about $170 billion. Now that's less than Fayval's tally of $214 billion, but not by that much. And this is largely because of the impact of not using money from the securitization program to fund the budget, which the PNP may want to clarify their position on. So would this bankrupt the country or lead to FinSac 2.0 like Fayval claimed? Well, according to this document from the Ministry of Finance, the government spent about $79 billion on FinSac up to 1998. The exchange rate in 1998 was 36 to 1 US. Today, it's approximately 160 to 1. So $79 billion in 1998 is $351 billion today, and that's only accounting for devaluation. I haven't factored in inflation at all. But by that basic, but admittedly imperfect calculation, the cost of the PNP's programs would be roughly half of what FinSac cost Jamaica. However, this is also not the full story. The PNP has indicated that they would use the portion of the budget allocated to discretionary spending to fund their plans. This means they would reallocate funds from some current programs. They're also counting on economic growth and higher tax revenues to make up some of the funding. Now, I think these two measures may be able to cover the PNP's tax givebacks and social spending, which amount to about $30.9 billion. But the most expensive issue is still covering that income from securitization. $140 billion is a lot of money. This is the second year that the government is using this source of funding. So what exactly is securitization and why is it so controversial? According to Investopedia, securitization is the practice of pooling assets that you wouldn't usually be able to trade easily, such as mortgages. Typically, you don't buy and sell mortgages on the open market. It then repackages those assets into a tradable security that bears interest. In the government's case, they're packaging some of their receivables and selling them off. Receivables are money that is owed to you. When you sell your receivables, the buyer gives you money now and then collects what is owed to you later. So let's say someone owes you $100, but it's not due for payment until 6 months or a year from now. A buyer might offer you $80. That way you get to collect $80 up front rather than having to wait several months. Then the buyer collects the full $100 from the person who owes you when it becomes due. In this case, the government is securitizing some of its future tax revenues. We all know the government is going to collect taxes. So for an investor, it's a pretty safe bet to buy the government's future tax revenues. But the PNP is opposed to the government selling these future taxes, which raises a serious issue. Because if the government doesn't do it, they'll be left with a $139 billion hole in the budget that they'd probably have to borrow. But if they do, they're taking future revenues to run the country now. Presumably, they're assuming that in the future, revenue will increase enough that it won't really matter. Here's how Fayval responded.
There is nothing wrong with securitization. The global securitized market is massive, nearly US 13 trillion. Research shows that 73% of residential mortgage debt is funded by securitization. 16% of auto loans are funded by securitization.
So, to securitize or not to securitize? That is the question. And that's the bottom line.